Jeff Lebby had some things to say about the Oklahoma offense and his quarterback. We'll talk about that on today's episode of Locked On Sooners.
You are Locked On Sooners, your daily podcast on the Oklahoma Sooners, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Sooner Nation, and welcome to Locked On Sooners. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Williams. You can follow me on Twitter at John9Williams, and joining me is Josh Helmer. You can follow him on Twitter at JoshOnRef. You can also hear him Monday through Friday from 9 to noon on 94.7 The Ref in Norman. Josh, what's up, man?
Oh, not a whole heck of a lot, I suppose. Just still thinking about OU Media Days and getting set for the start of fall camp here in Norman, Oklahoma.
Yes, football practice is about to get underway. So that means talking season is pretty much over, at least for the team and the players. Obviously, we'll be talking about the Oklahoma Sooners nonstop, 5 days a week for you here on the Locked On Sooners podcast. But Josh, Jeff Lebby had some really interesting things to say, namely about the quarterback. I feel like there was an attempt, at least by certain media members, to kind of downplay some of Dillon Gabriel's size, arm strength, things of that nature, kind of as it pertains to him potentially being a starting quarterback in the NFL. But let's hear what Jeff Lebby had to say about Dillon Gabriel and his ability to throw the deep ball.
I think one of the greatest things that Dillon does is throw the deep ball. I think if you look at all of his throws on tape and you go back to his freshman year, sophomore year, and then before he got hurt last year, he can push the ball down the field. So he's got great touch on it, understands how to get the ball out of his hand a little earlier if he needs to, but that's a strength of his for sure.
Your thoughts, Josh?
Yeah, well, seems like it would be a strength of his. I mean, he's got 8,000 plus passing yards in his career so far, 70 passing touchdowns. Doesn't seem like he's bashful to try to stretch the field. Now, does he maybe have the outright arm talent of the two quarterbacks that were just on campus for Oklahoma in a Caleb Williams or a Spencer Rattler? I don't know. Probably not. It's up for debate that maybe his arm strength isn't quite that, but I don't know that necessarily you always have to have that arm strength, especially at the college level, to be one of the nation's finest quarterbacks. And even in the National Football League, yeah, I mean, obviously you'd love to have a rocket, a cannon for an arm, but I don't know that that's you absolutely have to have that or the best out of everybody in the National Football League to be an effective starting quarterback. But hey, that's way down the road as far as it pertains to what he's going to do at the University of Oklahoma. I think Dillon Gabriel has illustrated over the course of his career that he's more than capable, John, of being a very, very effective collegiate quarterback.
I think of a guy like Drew Brees, back when he played for Purdue. Not the biggest guy. I mean, maybe he was 6 foot. Not the guy that you'd look at and be like, he's got the John Elway type of an arm. But he was a guy that was very, very effective getting the ball down the field. We saw it all throughout his career at New Orleans. Like, this was a team that, yeah, they used the short passing game, but man, he was great getting the ball down the field to guys like Lance Moore, Ted Ginn at times. And so arm strength is important, absolutely. But I think a lot of times, like, we underrate the idea of timing. And Jeff Lebby spoke to it. He's like, he knows how to get the ball out basically on time. He said a little bit early, but a lot of that just comes down to timing. I think of a guy like Dak Prescott for the Dallas Cowboys. He's a bigger guy. He's like 6'3", 6'4", weighs like 220, 230, but he doesn't necessarily have the strongest arm in the NFL either. But he's good at like anticipating when to release the ball on the deeper developing routes. And so I think that's something to like about Dillon Gabriel, is that even though he might have some limitations, he understands his limitations. And to compensate for that, you do have to get the ball out a little bit quicker. And I think we saw that a little bit in the spring game. It's like a guy might have started off covered on the deep route. I think of like Theo Weiss. He was running that go route down the left sideline. And, Dillon Gabriel releases it and he's kind of covered. But then Theo Weiss has the acceleration to be able to go out and get the ball and separate from the defensive back. And I think that's the thing. Those are the little things right there that make a bigger difference a lot of times than just having outright arm strength. Because if you think you can outthrow people, then a lot of times you're just going to be waiting on your guy to get far enough down the field, and then you throw it, and then it's going to be easier to cover. But if you get it out there before the safety can come over and offer some help, or the cornerback's able to catch up and really understand where the ball's at, if he's not anticipating the ball coming out as quickly as it does, then he's not going to be able to be looking for it necessarily and be able to defend it as easily. And so I think there's some things to what Jeff Lebby's saying, like some of those subtle attributes that we might not talk about as much when it comes to quarterbacks and passing. We look at accuracy and arm strength. That's kind of what everybody talks about. But anticipation, accuracy, those things are huge. And I think Dillon Gabriel's got some of those things. I think Dillon Gabriel is going to be a really, really good quarterback for the Oklahoma Sooners. How good, like what level he ascends to this season, that still remains to be seen. But I don't think there's any reason why he couldn't, end the season as one of the kind of the 10 best quarterback seasons in Oklahoma history. And they've had a lot of really good quarterback play, but he's just got that kind of, we saw it on Tuesday, just a little bit of the moxie, a little bit of the confidence, the swagger. He's got the full belief of his team and his coaching staff. And so, you might look at him and say, well, he's not very tall. He may not have the strongest arm, but we've seen it for decades in the NFL that it's not always the tallest or the strongest that end up winning as quarterbacks in the NFL. You can go all the way back to like a Joe Montana who won a lot of games. He didn't have the strongest arm, but he played with anticipation. You can look at a guy like Doug Flutie, who is small, another left-handed quarterback, awkward in the pocket sometimes, won a lot of games, played a long time in the NFL, had a great college career. I mean, so many guys you could run through that had a lot of success despite being somewhat limited in different spots. And I know I'm going on and on about this, but I as a short guy myself, 5'9", 5'10", I think it's really important that we look at the things he can do well. And I think there are a lot of things that Dillon Gabriel does very, very well.
Well, and it's not like his arm strength stinks. I mean, he could really sling the football. Physically, I don't even know if he's much of a detriment in that department. I really don't think that necessarily Dillon Gabriel is. I mean, I think that he's pretty, got a pretty powerful arm and accurate and great anticipation and all those things you were talking about. To your point, some of the final items you were touching on there, Stetson Bennett. Is Stetson Bennett a 6'5", 6'6" quarterback? No, he's 5'11". Stetson Bennett, would you describe him as one of the nation's top 5, top 10, top 15 passers last season? Maybe, right?
Maybe.
I mean, in terms of just like raw draft talent, no, you wouldn't. You definitely wouldn't describe him in that category. But yet, what does he do? Because of the sum of the parts around him, he leads Georgia to a national championship. And I say that to get here to this. Oklahoma has had Baker Mayfield. They have had Kyler Murray. They had another season, little bridge season there from Jalen Hurts, where Jalen Hurts did a lot of really good things for Oklahoma. They had the first season with Spencer Rattler, where Spencer Rattler is the best quarterback in the Big 12 Conference, right? I mean, they had some real firepower last season when Caleb Williams initially took over. Oklahoma's had some great quarterback play. So Dillon Gabriel, if he can get somewhere close to that, well, really what you're banking on is that Dillon Gabriel doesn't necessarily have to be quite like all of those different guys. If he could be close to and not necessarily right at the Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray type seasons, well, what you're hoping is that with Brent Venables coming in, with Jeff Lebby coming in, offensively, what they're trying to do, rushing the football and just some other things tempo-wise, that maybe Dillon Gabriel won't have to be, no pun intended, Caleb Williams, but maybe you won't have to be Superman every single week, right? That maybe that defense can be improved a little bit. And we've seen in college football as recently as last season, okay, you don't have to have the number one quarterback in America to go win a national championship. And Dillon Gabriel is certainly, okay, if he's not the number one quarterback in America, which probably he's not going to be Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, I think that's fair. That's fine. We can all agree on that. Man, I go back to, I think what you said there, which is, I think he could be a top 5, top 10 type quarterback. I certainly think he could be a Heisman hopeful type quarterback. And if everything else comes along for OU, I mean, come on, what are we talking about here? He's got more than enough tools to lead Oklahoma to where they want to go.
So just looking real quick at Pro Football Focus, I love Pro Football Focus. I know a lot of people aren't fond of their grading system, but I love it for their advanced stats. So over the 2019-2020 seasons, he threw for 28 touchdowns on throws greater than 20 yards down the field. Now, his completion percentage wasn't great, but he has a willingness to throw the deep ball. He can get it in the end zone, and he doesn't throw a lot of interceptions. So he only, in that, of those attempts, only 4 were intercepted. I think it was like more than 160 attempts throwing the deep ball. Like he threw, in 2020, he was, I think it was third in completions more than 20 yards in NCAA, like behind just Zach Wilson and Kyle Trask. So actually, no, he tied with Zach Wilson for the most completions on throws more than 20 yards down the field. So he's got the ability, he's got the skill. We can debate some of the accuracy stuff. A lot of that's going to depend a little bit dependent on your wide receiver as well. Are they getting into the right position to catch that pass? Only film can tell us that. But I think I like where we're at. I love where we're at with quarterback. I think Marvin Mims, Theo Weiss are both going to excel down the field with Dillon Gabriel throwing them the football. We got more Jeff Lebby to hear from. We got even some Dillon Gabriel that we'll hear from him maybe in the next episode. But we're going to hear a little bit more from Jeff Lebby on the running back room. But that's after I talk to you about Built Bar. Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar ever, 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 ever. If you haven't tried Built Puffs yet, you are depriving yourself of one of life's greatest joys. And guess what? There's a new flavor. It's indulgent cookie dough covered in chocolate. That's right. Built has done it again. The cookie dough chunk puffs have a light and chewy texture, real cookie dough chunks. And of course, they're covered in 100% real chocolate like only Built Bar can do. So if you haven't tried them yet, go to Built.com. Use our promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your next order at Built.com for cookie dough chunk puffs that are only 160 calories and have a whopping 15 grams of protein. Again, low calorie, high protein, and low sugar. So go to Built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, get 15% off your next order at Built.com. All right, so Jeff Lebby also had this to say. We talked a little bit about what he had to say about the running back room and Eric Gray in particular, but let's hear what he had to say just about the running back position.
Is going to start with EG, obviously. Eric's done an unbelievable job. I've said this since being around him for 5 days. The guy's a pro. Everything he does is in a professional manner. So could not be more excited about where he's at and what he's going to be able to do for us this fall. Marcus is, it's all about consistency for him. I think everybody understands when he's gotten opportunities, he's done a really good job. And so excited about where he's at. He had a good summer. And then the 2 young guys, obviously Javonte was here in the spring, had a really good spring for a young guy just getting into it, and Gavin's incredibly talented. We were talking about foot speed earlier, and he's got it. So excited about that room. Maybe not a ton of production or experience from a depth standpoint, but guys that are capable and willing for sure. So excited about all those guys.
There's a lot to be excited about. There's still a lot we need to see, and I think it's okay to have both of those feelings. Like, you can be excited about Marcus Major, but we have to see him produce on the field. You can be excited about Javonte Barnes and what his potential brings. But again, freshman, we have a lot to see from him still. What were your kind of big takeaways from that?
My big takeaways are we buying all of this with Eric Gray? Now, I'm 100% sold on what he's talking about when he says, hey, it took me less than 5 days of being around Eric Gray for me to say, wow, this guy, he operates like a professional. Remember just a year ago, last spring, I guess a little over a year ago now, but a year ago, we were hearing that same sort of line of thinking, right? Those same comments from DeMarco Murray and from Oklahoma about Eric Gray and his professional type approach, how quickly he picked up the playbook. And it's been no surprise that obviously Jeff Lebby coming in, we're hearing more of that with Eric Gray. But just on a production basis, not that Jeff Lebby outright came out and said, hey, Eric Gray's our number one back, but he did start that response with it. It starts with EG, right? Which would lead you to believe that, okay, Eric Gray probably has the, no pun intended, leg up right now in the running back room. Are you buying that?
Yeah, I'm 100% buying it. I want to go back to his 2020 season with Tennessee. averages 4.9 yards per carry, rushes for 758 yards on just 156 carries, has 401 yards after contact. I mean, this is a guy that was productive when he got an opportunity against the SEC. Like Tennessee, not the powerhouse of the SEC, but the offensive line is good enough for him to put up pretty solid production. I mean, I go back to what I said on our last episode. I just think they gave up on him too quick last year. I mean, am I asking them to give him 20 carries a game, 25 carries a game? Absolutely not. But when you have a guy that is as electric as he can be, you got to get him more than 3 touches a game, especially against teams like Oklahoma State and Baylor and Iowa State, where you're struggling to move the ball. And this is not a knock against Kennedy Brooks and I'm not even saying take any carries away from Kennedy Brooks, but like some of those things that you were trying to do with some of your wide receivers, get the ball out in space, like that's Eric Gray. I mean, you think back to the Kansas game, the offense really wasn't doing much. And then they throw a little swing pass out to Eric Gray. And what's he do? He takes it nearly for a touchdown. I think he got it down close to like inside the 5-yard line, but it was like a big 20, 30-yard chunk play. But I felt like they didn't look to do that enough. And so I'm excited to kind of see where he lands. I don't think they're going to make him this bell cow running back. I don't think that they're going to ask him to run the ball 20, 25 times a game. But I would think like 10 carries a game at least, 5 to 7 targets a game, or 12 and 5, something like that, where he's getting anywhere from 14 to 17 touches a game, I think is reasonable. And then you've got another 10 to 15 carries that you kind of intersperse between Marcus Major and Javonte Barnes and Gavin Sawchuk and the UCF transfer, Bentavious Thompson as well. Like you've got some guys that you can hand the ball to. I think there's going to be some roles for various guys like Bentavious Thompson. I could very easily see him being kind of their short yardage goal line style of back. Same with like a Marcus Major. I could see him being kind of like the closer, like you put him out there, in the fourth quarter and you're trying to like run down the clock and grind it out. He's a guy that you can hand the ball to, 10 times in a row and not have to worry about, is he going to be able to handle the punishment? We've seen like when he gets the ball in, groupings, like whether it's the Alamo Bowl or, different times, short spurts, that he's able to handle the punishment a little bit. Guys like Javonte Barnes and Gavin Sawchuk, it remains to be seen. They could even redshirt those guys. I don't think that they'll redshirt Barnes, but he could even fall into a similar role as Marcus Major. But I think that there's going to be a bit of a role for everybody on this team. But I think for the most part, it's going to be Eric Gray, at least to start the season. We'll find out a lot more after that Nebraska, Kansas State, TCU run about how this running back group is kind of tiered up, the hierarchy of it, and how the carriers are going to, kind of divide themselves amongst the running back room.
Yeah, that trip to Lincoln. After that, we'll probably either have your number one running back locked in, or maybe you're looking to start going a different direction or give multiple guys more serious looks at the running back room. I think, to me, this is arguably the most fascinating position group for Oklahoma going into next season. Offensive line, that will be equally as important for Oklahoma. And it's a position group that you look at and you say, okay, well, that offensive line, their growth is going to go a long way in determining the ultimate success or failure of Oklahoma. But I don't know that there's as much mystery or intrigue around the offensive line. There's, I guess, a couple of spots that you could look at and say, okay, that's up for grabs. But really, we think a pretty good idea who the 2 starting tackles are going to be, right? We got a pretty good idea who we think the 2 starting guards are going to be and who the starting center is going to be. It's easy to map out what you think the projected offensive line for Oklahoma is going to be. Yeah, we could sit here and say this about Eric Gray right now, but it's not going to shock me if by week 4 or 5, we're talking about Marcus Major getting the bulk of the carries for Oklahoma. Or if along the way we're talking about Javonte Barnes or Gavin Sawchuk having really burst onto the scene, because I think those two guys, those freshmen, John, I've said it all offseason, I think they might be the 2 most talented guys that they have in their collective backfield. So, there's only, if that's the case, if that's indeed true about Javonte Barnes and Gavin Sawchuk, man, There's only so long you can't give those guys toes.
Forgot that I was muted there for a second. My apologies. I think there's only so like you're only going to see so much of these guys early in the season. I think Javante Barnes will see against UTEP and Kent State, especially if they're able to build a big lead against those teams. But I think they're going to want to try and get Bentavious work. I think they want to see what Tawi Walker might have too. So we may not see like what their true running back rotation is going to look like the first couple weeks of the season. But I think you're right. The trip to Nebraska, that's going to be kind of the telltale sign, at least for that first game. Like if they can, if Eric Gray comes out and just has this breakout performance and has, 100 yards rushing, another 30, 40 yards receiving, like I think it pretty much that's who you go with. If you are going to go with Marcus Major, if it's going to be a running back committee, I think we'll see that in that first game against Nebraska, or that not first game, but that third game against Nebraska, which I think could very well be the case, is that this becomes a running back committee and it's very situational and dependent on how each guy's looking that week and kind of how it all plays out. But I really think that with this team, with so much turnover that they've experienced over the last 8-9 months, I really think that they're trying to find as many guys that are veteran like guys to have on the field at the right time. Obviously, they want to put the best players out there, but if there's something that if everything's equal and Eric Gray you just feel more comfortable with, I think that's the route they're going to go. His dual threat ability is going to give them options when they're on offense, and I think that's a good thing. It's more, what is he going to be able to do kind of as a multi-purpose runner? I feel like we can see that. Like there are times where we can see him being a really good runner. I mean, he had a really good game against Nebraska last year. But then there's times where, like I said, I feel like they just gave up on him too early. They'll give him one carry and it doesn't really do much. And then they're like, oh, well, we're not done. We're not using Eric Gray anymore. And like, that's it. Like, really? Come on.
And one carry where it's like halfback dive, right?
Yeah.
Maybe Eric Gray's not, designed to 15 times a game run, in between the center and the guard, right? I mean, some off tackle, just some things that get him out toward the perimeter. And the other thing with this running back race, John, that obviously always going to be imperative, but I do think tilts in the favor of both Eric Gray and Marcus Major, is ball security. Not that Javante Barnes and Gavin Sawchuk, not that they are two guys coming in as true freshmen that we think are going to cough it up a bunch, but we've kind of seen and have a pretty good idea that both Eric Gray and Marcus Major are going to take care of the football historically. So, I mean, obviously, with ball security being a premium, it's always going to be a premium. If those two guys, I mean, if that's better than the two youngsters, if you can trust that more, then that's going to point the compass in their direction.
Yeah, so speaking of Pro Football Focus, I've talked about my affinity for them. So I'm looking at Eric Gray's rushing by direction. Again, they've got it all broken down there. So he ran the ball between the guard and the center 224 times. For 224 yards last year. It was 50 times between the guard and the center. And then a combined 50 or 46 times off the left end, right end, like outside the tight end, outside the either tight end. So I'm like, they ran it more up the middle, like straight up the middle, than they did running to the outside with Eric Gray last year. I mean, I feel like that just goes to show like the misusage of one of your more dynamic players when you're trying to get him running straight at defensive tackles every time, and then like he ran another 10 plays off of, between the left guard and the left tackle, another, 14 between right guard and right tackle, like almost, a big chunk of what he did was between the tackles last year. So like you're not telling me you can run more to the outside, like more to the wide, more wide zone, more, toss plays, counter to the outside. Like, I don't know. It just one more like little needle that just pricks at me every single time I look at his or Marvin Mims like stat breakdowns. I'm just like, I'm irritated all over again. And so I think like, depending on how they use him, I think he could just be a really dynamic player. And obviously if you run him behind the center 20 times a game, that's not going to help you. But if you, kind of needle and prod that a little bit so that you can then work outside, that's where the game's at. Like, that's how you're going to most effectively use Eric Gray. Any other thoughts on this before we wrap up there, Josh?
I just can't wait to watch all of this unfold with these running backs. What he said about Marcus Major too leads me to believe that Jeff Lebby's pretty high on Marcus Major. And one of the things that DeMarco Murray has said a lot throughout the spring and just the other day again at OU Media Days is, Marcus Major is one of my favorites, if not my favorite, in the backfield. I mean, he really digs Marcus Major, so it's a good sign when the running backs coach says, "Oh, he's my favorite running back." And that's could bode well for Marcus Major. While there's some signs that kind of point toward this thing maybe really being Eric Gray's job, I'm going to hold off on totally subscribing to and believing that the more I've thought about it. I still think this race is very wide open. I think Eric Gray will get the bulk of the looks maybe early, but I don't think this thing's ironed down by any stretch of the imagination. And I think all three of those other primary names, Marcus Major, the two freshmen that we've talked about, I still think they're very much in play here.
Yeah, and it's going to be a week-to-week thing. I think competition never stops with Brent Venables. Just because you're a starter week 1 doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a starter week 5 or week 12. I think that's just going to be the way things are, and that's not a bad thing. You get your best 11 out on the field whenever you can. I think he's going to be one of their best 11, given how many plays they're going to run, how much they're going to throw the ball. I think he's going to be out there for a big portion of the offensive plays. But I think you're right that we're going to see these other guys worked in as well in a big way. Marcus Major is kind of the guy that everybody's just been waiting to kind of take that next step based on just the small glimpses of what we've seen out of the guy. Like, somebody asked the question the other day about Marcus Major, just his ability as a dual threat runner too, like his ability to catch the ball out of the backfield. Go back to the Florida game in the Cotton Bowl a couple years ago. And he had like this big 70-something yard touchdown reception, like caught the ball in the short area of the field and then, just dusted everybody for a touchdown. You're like, okay, so dude's got the power. He's got the speed. So now he's got to make sure that he can stay on the field and get him the ball. Like, please, come on. This has got to be the year that the dude gets like 10, 12 carries a game, because he's the one that I'm most intrigued to watch. Like, if I can get out to practice, and then obviously week 1, like, get this guy a bulk of carries, let him do work, and let's see what happens on the field.
Marcus Major has been the appetizer that Oklahoma fans have been enjoying for dessert, right? It's like, it's tasty appetizer. What you've seen, haven't enjoyed the full meal yet, and yet it's always kind of in mop-up duty for the most part throughout his career. Now, the bowl game play that you're talking about wouldn't really necessarily totally fit that description, but yeah, I'm intrigued. I'm excited to see what a Marcus Major can do in potentially much more meaningful snaps.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be the year that we see it. So, very interesting position at the running back position. We got more that we'll talk about on the next episode with Jeff Lebby. We got some Dillon Gabriel cuts we want to get to as well from Media Day. We'll talk about that on our next episode of Locked On Sooners. So, thank you so much for listening to today. Watching, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And on YouTube, we're free and available on all platforms. Make sure you go follow us on Twitter at Locked On Sooners and on Facebook, Locked On Sooners Podcast. Follow Josh on Twitter at JoshOnRef and myself at John9Williams. And we will catch you next time. Boomer Sooner.